So many of you know that I am a mom to boys, 3 boys. God knew what he was doing when he gave Alan and I boys. I'm not well equipped for the girl drama stuff. My experience of being a mom to boys tells me that generally speaking, boys are easier when they're older, a little harder when they're younger. I could never get one of my boys to just sit and color, unless it was coloring on our walls in our home. Then they were glad to do that. So I know that, there's some differences, some things about being boys. Boys can be hard on the house. They can be hard on the structure of the house. We have drywall holes to prove that. And we are connoisseurs of emergency rooms. We are connoisseurs of scars and staples. We are connoisseurs of orthopedic surgeons. We know all about all of that stuff. All my kids got extra credit in anatomy and physiology for bringing in their x-rays and their hardware from whatever surgery they'd had to pin themselves together. So, as a rule in our house, we learned that you don't call mom with an emergency unless there's a bone sticking out. That was the threshold. Boys are boys. My boys were boys. And they also were the son of a firefighter. They were sons of a firefighter, which meant that pain is temporary, scars are forever. And you better have a good story to go along with the scar. Shark bites and harrowing rescues are much better stories than accidentally cutting yourself while shaving or tripping over a curb. The main character of the scripture that I'm going to read for you today, Jacob, this main character, he walks away with a scar. He walks away actually with a limp and a good story to go along with that limp. See, Jacob, as we enter this part of his story, he has some history to face. He finds himself alone and isolated overnight, but he doesn't walk away from the struggle. He doesn't walk away from the struggle that he is in the midst of, and that struggle becomes real. And he emerges scarred, but stronger for it. So here's some background about Jacob as we kind of bridge the gap between the story of last week of Isaac and now his son Jacob. So Isaac, if you remember, married Rebekah. Rebekah and Isaac have twins, Esau and Jacob. And even in the womb, Esau and Jacob wrestled. Esau was born first, the firstborn, and because of that, he stood to inherit everything. And even though he was a twin, that second-born Jacob, because he was second, stood to just get some things, but not the massive inheritance that Esau would get. And so we have another chapter in the Genesis soap opera of the people of God. So Esau and Jacob grow up. Jacob becomes a trickster. Jacob convinces his brother Esau to sell his birthright to him. Jacob convinces and tricks his father into blessing himself, Jacob, instead of Esau with the inheritance. Over the course of time, Jacob was tricky, and he would eventually prevail in his way, but his character was developing kind of in a wrong way. And once he convinces his father to bless him instead of Esau, his brother, is furious, raging mad, murderously mad. And so Jacob flees back to the land of his ancestors, lives with his uncle for a while, and finds a beautiful Rachel who he wants to be his wife. But his uncle tells him, well, Rachel can be your wife, but you got to work for me for 7 years. He does. But Rachel has a not as attractive older sister. And so Laban, the father of these two, Leah and Rachel, tricks Jacob into marrying Leah first. And then has to work another 7 years to be able to marry Rachel. So the tables have now been turned on Jacob, who had been tricking people in life. Now the tables are turned. But Jacob settles down into his life with Leah and Rachel. And at the time that this story is going to be read, they have produced 12 children, 11 sons, 1 daughter. And also Jacob has been very successful as a cattleman. He has herds of goats and sheep and cows and camels and donkeys. And he ends up tricking his own uncle into giving him even more of his share of the herd. And God comes to Jacob. After all of this life experience, God comes to Jacob and he says, Jacob, it is time for you to return home. It is time for you to face your brother Esau. This frightens Jacob. But Jacob is a man of faith. He listens to God and he prepares to go and meet his brother Esau, even though he believes it will ultimately result in his death. Jacob is fearful, not only for himself, but also for his wives, his children, and all of the people that accompany him. He is not alone. He is traveling with hundreds of people that have become part of his tribe. And they move ever closer to where Esau is and have a report that there are 400 men waiting for Jacob with Esau. Jacob is sure that he and some of his family will die. And so on the eve of the crossing, on the eve of the evening that they are going to cross over the Jabbok River, Jacob goes to God in prayer and prays a prayer not only for himself, but recognizes the relationship now that he has with God. Prays that he will be protected by God. Then he divides up his families and his herds so that at least if one part is harmed, the other gets away. And he sends them all over the river. And when he finally sends his wives and his children over, Jacob is left alone. And here's what happens. This is out of Genesis chapter 32, beginning with verse 22. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives and his 2 maidservants and his 11 sons and daughter, and he crossed the ford at Jabbok. And after he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with people and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "This it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. This is the word of the Lord. So there's Jacob, sending all that he had across the river and alone, by himself, struggling with what is about to happen. He knew that he had to cross that Jabbok River. He knew that he had to cross back into his past. Now, I have never really had the desire to attend any of my high school reunions or hang out with the people that I went to high school with. I've been to a handful of events. Most of them have been either weddings or funerals, and it brings people together, and then we're forced to relive our past, and I find that difficult, mostly because I have regret about my past, mostly because I'm not super excited about who I was in the past. And I'm fearful that who I have become is not enough to erase what I was in the past. So I'm not super excited about crossing that Jabbok River in my own life and facing what is there. Just this week, Alan bought one of those UT t-shirts. I don't know if you saw them. There was a student in Florida. They had a day at school where you're supposed to wear the team that you support. And he didn't have a Tennessee t-shirt and didn't have the money to get one. So he made his own. He wore an orange shirt and then put a notebook piece of paper on that with a big U and a T. And it said University of Tennessee. And it was really cute. And he got bullied for that. He got made fun of in school for the shirt that he wore. So someone actually mass-produced these shirts just as his drawing was, and they've been selling them, and the proceeds go to anti-bullying organizations and campaigns. Alan bought one of those shirts, although he didn't wear it during the Tennessee game yesterday. Anyhow, we bought one of those shirts, and we were in our living room yesterday making arrangements for my mom to move in, and Alan pulls out the shirt, and he and Carter are talking about it, and I'm sitting in the chair, and he's like, yeah, I want to get the shirt because it's all about anti-bullying or whatever. And as he and Carter are walking in the garage, he goes, yeah, because I know I was bullied when I was growing up. And my son Carter, my middle child, yeah, he was bullied. And so they're walking out, and as if like, you understand. And I'm like, yeah, I understand because I was the bully. And I felt really bad. Because that's my past, and that's the Jabbok I don't want to cross back over to. I don't want to greet that past. It's hard to go back sometimes, to acknowledge the unfinished business and the unresolved feelings that we have. But Jacob knows that that's where his identity lies. He's been told by God that he needs to cross back over. He must deal with that fractured relationship that he has with his brother Esau. And he has to deal with the deeper struggle that he has with God. And in fact, he ends up wrestling with God and doesn't even know that it's God at first. During this fitful night that Jacob has alone on the banks of the Jabbok, his hip is literally thrown out. Bill would know all about that, right? It's thrown out, but he continues to hold on for a blessing. Jacob holds on and asks for a blessing. And then by God, he is pressed into revealing his name, which literally means heal. Jacob literally means heel because he was holding on to his brother's heel as he was being born after wrestling with him for months while in the womb. But Jacob, by all accounts, had lived up to his name. He was a heel. I would imagine there were probably feelings that he had about his name, probably feelings of shame. And God asks him, "What is your name?" "My name is Jacob." It would be like saying, "They call me a heel." He had been a wrestler his whole life, a huckster, a contemptible person. But his ability to wrestle was about to become a blessing. Jacob would not let go. His instincts kicked in and would not release the man until he provided a blessing. And God renames Jacob Israel. God renames Jacob. God remakes Jacob right there, right then and there, and renames him Israel, which means wrestles with God. See, that was the identity now of Jacob. That was going to be the identity now of the people of God, people who would wrestle with God and God would wrestle back. And they would hold on to one another. They would be blessed by this dynamic relationship with God, and then they themselves would become a blessing. They wrestled with God. Jacob wrestled with God. God wrestled back, and they held on to one another. They grappled. They grappled with the things of life. Sometimes we, I think, mistake and misunderstand that faith gives us a life of serenity, a life of tranquility. We will just through our life. But we know life to be frenetic. We need a Calgon moment. And if you're too young to know that reference, it's about soaking in the tub and a mom just needing Calgon to take her away. We live frenetic lives and we need that moment of tranquility. But faith doesn't promise that. I'm not even sure that Calgon can deliver on that. We want to find that moment. We want to have that peace and serenity. But when we look to Jacob, when we look to Jacob's character, it's about struggle. It's a deeply powerful story with no simple answers like everything's going to be fine. Because his identity, our identity, is marked by struggle. Our identity is defined by wrestling with God, by holding on and allowing God to hold on to us. And in that moment, we are blessed. In that not letting go is the remarkable act of faith. That is what faith is, that not letting go, so that we will be characterized by our relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Out of struggle, God will bless you, and you will find your identity. It is not easy. Jacob spent the rest of his life with a limp. Pain is temporary. Scars are forever. But that scar meant that Jacob had seen God face to face. In that struggle, God is revealed. And when Jacob meets Esau, after he crosses that river, Jacob runs to him and embraces him and forgives him. An outcome that Jacob had never dreamed of. Yes, Jacob walks away with a limp, but he is victorious and no longer ashamed. Amen.